All right, good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me good? Perfect. My name is Paige Hildebrand. I'm the Director of Events here at the Frontier Culture Museum, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the museum to our Lord Dunmore's War Weekend. Thank you all for coming out. Now, before we get on with our program today, I do just want to give a brief thanks to the Virginia Humanities Society. They have generously sponsored parts of our program for this weekend, as well as the American Frontier Culture Foundation. The foundation allows us to put on all of these wonderful programs that we have, as well as provide scholarships for our summer camps and field trips. So, like I said, I'd like to give a big thank you to them. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker this weekend, and that is Dr. David Preston, who's speaking on Braddock's defeat from from Braddock's defeat to Dunmore's War, the transformation of early American warfare.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for coming out to this 250th anniversary commemoration of Dunmore's War, and I hope that you have a wonderful time at this wonderful site. As a quick aside, when I started to work on my book entitled Braddock's Defeat, this was one of the sites that I came to early on in my research, because the story of Braddock's expedition certainly involves the colony of Virginia. As you'll see here and learn, Braddock's army came through the area of the valley just a little bit north of Winchester, Virginia. And so I knew that I needed to get a handle on the 18th century Virginia cultures, I should say, that were here in the Great Valley. And so this was a wonderful site that helped me to again understand these different cultures that were represented here in the Great Valley of the 18th century. So it's really a treat for me to come back here and to share with you a lot of my passion for the 18th century, and in particular this exact time period we're talking about, this roughly 20-year period that's framed by the French and Indian War, which begins here in America in 1754, and Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, which one of my friends and colleagues has described as the last Indian conflict of the colonial era, so right on the eve of the Revolution. I'm just really happy that y'all came out today, and I want you to be thinking of questions that you have that you want to ask about this time period, and I'm going to try to land the ship here with some time for Q&A at the end. So again, thanks for being here today, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. When I first started to write this book on Braddock's defeat in the year 1755, I was drawn to this topic for several reasons. First of all, I knew that Braddock's defeat was this monumental British military disaster. One of the greatest military disasters in the whole history of the British Army. And I also knew that this was a defeat that had enormous consequences for the whole trajectory of American history. Braddock's defeat is a battle that really escalated this brewing conflict in North America into what we know as the French and Indian War. But what's important to note here is that the French and Indian War was part of this global conflict called the 7 Years' War, which will end in the year 1763. And I was also drawn being at the Citadel, the military academy in South Carolina, and teaching our future officers in the military, I was very attuned to how Braddock's defeat tells us a story about some of the changes, the important changes that are happening in warfare in colonial America. And that's really the focus of my remarks today. So I framed this as from Braddock's defeat to Dunmore's War, the transformation of early American warfare. And so what I want you to think about here as we're going along today is that I'm taking you from something to something, okay? We're going from something to something. And I want to start off that theme with this quote from George Washington. In the year 1757, Washington at this point is, he's 25 years old. He's here on the frontier of Virginia trying to hold things together when it seems like the colony's frontier is falling apart at the seams. And he writes this letter to the British commander-in-chief, the new commander-in-chief in North America, named the Earl of Loudoun, from which Loudoun County obtains its name. And he's trying to more or less provide the incoming commander-in-chief with a briefing on what's been happening here in the colony of Virginia. And so he talks about some of the events that I'm going to talk about here, how the war began on the frontier of Virginia and the Ohio Valley, and how things escalated from there. He'll mention Braddock's defeat, for example. But one phrase or one set of sentences here that's always caught my attention is what you're seeing here. And I'm gonna read this for us. Washington tells Lord Loudoun, here I quote, "Virginia is a country young in war. Until the breaking out of these disturbances, Virginia has lived in the most profound and tranquil peace, never studying war or warfare. It is not, therefore, to be imagined she can fall into proper measures all at once. All that can be expected at her hands she cheerfully gives, the sinews of war. And we only want a person of your lordship's ability and experience to direct the application." So what Washington is saying here is that, and I think that he does not really exaggerate that much, that Virginia at the beginning of the 1750s was a colony young and inexperienced in war. And in fact, George Washington in that sense kind of personifies the colony. He is young and inexperienced. He's learning on the job, literally. And I think he's on to something here that, prior to the outbreak of the French and Indian War, Virginia really hadn't had to mobilize the colony for a long, drawn-out conflict like the French and Indian War. Virginia had its militia, but Virginia had never stood up with one important exception in recent years. Gooch's Virginia Regiment of the 1740s, Virginia had never really stood up any type of long-term military forces beyond the militia. All that to say, what I want you to think about here in my remarks today is that we're going to see Virginia as a colony, young and inexperienced in war, incapable of projecting military force into the interior of the continent, particularly the hot spot that everybody is after, which is the Ohio Valley. That's the point of contention. And we go from this youth and inexperience to Dunmore's War in 1774. And something happens over the course of that 20-year period where Virginia does become experienced. Virginia does become effective in its application of military force. In Dunmore's War in 1774, Virginia is capable of sending two different expeditions simultaneously from the frontiers of Virginia here deep into the heart of the Ohio Valley, into the country of the Shawnee Nation. So I think one way to say this is what had not been capable what had not been possible really in 1754 is possible in 1774. And that's what I mean by this transformation in war that's taking place. So let's back up just a tiny bit here and pick up some of the context for what we're talking about here. I'm going to try to keep this short just in the interest of time. If somebody wants to ask me more about the origins of the French and Indian War, I'm happy to oblige. But this war began as a competition over the strategic Ohio Valley, which was part of, as the Virginians saw it, part of their claims in North America. The French also saw this region as theirs, as did the truest owners of the land, the native peoples who lived in the Ohio Valley, the Delawares, the Shawnees, and others. And these competitions, these overlapping claims will come to a boiling point in the early 1750s. And fighting will break out in 1754. George Washington, as a young officer, 22 years of age, is literally at the tip of the spear, leading Virginia forces in trying to establish British control and therefore British claims and mastery over the Ohio Valley. Some of the actions that he participated in that you might know about would be his ambush of a French party led by a French officer named Ensign Coulon de Jumonville, and then the subsequent battle of Fort Necessity in July of 1754. Think about that. George Washington is involved in some of these skirmishes that will eventually escalate into a global war. I think the Europeans, they thought they might be able to contain this to North America initially, but partly because of Braddock's defeat, as you'll see, the stakes escalate, and in 1756, Britain and France will declare war against each other, which is what really makes this a global conflict, fought all over the world. It begins here. So that's a map of the Ohio Valley. The Virginians were unable to establish British control in the region. And the French and their native allies were able to gain full control of the Ohio Valley. They established several forts in that region. And it seems as though the French really have the momentum on their side. It seems that the British are really on the ropes. And this is one of the considerations that leads the British government back in London to see this as a really dangerous situation, one that's getting out of control, one that these colonials apparently can't manage on their own. This is a recipe for the king's troops. So, in 1755, the British well, this decision is actually made in 1754 to send over a British regular army officer, Major General Edward Braddock. And the British will send Braddock over with 2 regiments of the King's Army, a complement of Royal Artillery engineers, to accomplish what these apparently incompetent colonials can't do on their own. And that was indeed the expectation, I think, that the regulars here would quickly right the ship and be able to eject the French from the Ohio Valley. So General Braddock's target was indeed a specific point, the forks of the Ohio, which is where the modern city of Pittsburgh stands today. The French had begun building a classic Vauban-style fortification called Fort Duquesne. In order for the British to take that fort, they're going to need artillery. And therein lies the challenge of Braddock's whole expedition. You see, Braddock's forces will land in Virginia. They eventually make their way up to Alexandria, which is kind of their point of departure. And from that point, they're going to have to march westward and northwest about 300 miles, call it, across the Appalachian Mountains, over which there is no improved road. You know, there's some horse trails, some trading paths, things like that, but there's no road that's capable of transporting artillery pieces that weigh upwards of, say, 1 ton. And what Braddock accomplishes is something new under the sun. When I was writing my book, I quickly realized, like, this is an amazing achievement here, and it represents this transformation in British military capability that I'm talking about. So when Braddock starts marching westward, it's a march that has an incredible achievement, and that is that the British are building and constructing a well-engineered military road across those mountains. General Braddock, in essence, breaches that Appalachian barrier for the first time. And Braddock conducts one of the most rapid marches in all of early American history. The French, for their part, for example, they didn't think it was possible for a conventional army like Braddock's to actually get siege artillery across the mountains. Well, Braddock does exactly that. By early July of 1755, Braddock is on the doorsteps of the French, about 12 miles from his target, Fort Duquesne. You know, whenever whenever I think about Braddock's achievement here, it's still a marvel to me. It was a marvel to these men who built it. One of my favorite quotes, which is displayed here, it's from a British major by the name of William Spark. This guy has seen a lot of campaigning and battles in his time, and yet he says this about Braddock's march. "We began our march, but surely such a one was never undertaken before. I apprehend it will be looked upon as romantic by those who did not see and therefore cannot comprehend the difficulties of that march." Who do y'all think actually built the road day in and day out? The British regulars or the American provincial troops who were there along for the ride? The working party largely consists of the American provincials. And I want you to tuck that little detail away, because one of the things that I think is happening here is that the American colonials are gaining a lot of experience in the French and Indian War in what we call today logistics. You know, the ability to sustain military forces in the field, to be able to move military forces from point A to point B, to project that force. Well, this is a map of Braddock's road from Cumberland, Maryland, where Fort Cumberland was located, up to the area of Fort Duquesne. Again, Braddock achieved something really remarkable here. These are some pictures I've taken over the years of some of the extant scars of Braddock's road that are still up in the mountains of Western Virginia, West Virginia, Western Maryland, and Western Pennsylvania. You know, and some of the, you go out there and you look at some of the steep inclines that this road surmounted, and it's just staggering to think of soldiers and horses, yet again pulling a 1-ton artillery piece up these grades. This road, spoiler alert here, these roads were actually used well into the early 1800s, after the British, you know, they go on to win the war, as we know, and these roads essentially open up the Ohio Valley and points west to a lot of American colonial settlers. So, as I like to say it, as I put it in my book, Braddock's victory was the road that he built across arguably the greatest barrier to these British colonists of westward expansion, the Appalachian Mountains themselves. Well, the story of the actual Battle of Braddock's defeat can be summarized pretty quickly. This was an unexpected disaster, for sure, and it occurred at a point in the march, in the campaign, when the British were just supremely confident that they were on the cusp of victory. The French, the Indians, had done very little to stymie the British on their march. And when the British crossed the Monongahela River, again about 12 miles to the southeast of the fort, they feel that it's game over for the French defenders, and it's at that point that disaster strikes. On the early afternoon of July the 9th, 1755, General Braddock's column, distended for about 1 mile in length, is struck by a smaller but potent combined French and Indian force. It's important to note here that native warriors compose 2/3 of the whole coalition. And it really is a coalition because it includes not just the French, but upwards of 20 different native nations drawn from Canada, the Great Lakes, and even the Mississippi Valley. And the easy way to summarize Braddock's defeat is it really represents, honestly, the failure of the British fighting in more of a conventional mode, as they were trying to do battle in the forest, in the woods, against an unconventional opponent that is not fighting in dense ranks, lines of battle. And here we can see how the French and their native allies in particular are the truest masters of warfare in early America. They know how to fight effectively in this environment with really economical force. They're not burdened by wagon trains, having to haul artillery everywhere. So in the space of 4 hours, this French and Indian attack on Braddock's column utterly devastates the British. And in the space of those 4 hours, 2 out of every 3 British soldiers who crossed the river that day will be killed or wounded. It's a slaughter. And that is certainly how it was received in the British world when news of the disaster reached the newspapers and went across the Atlantic in late July and early August of 1755. One Army return that I always come back to is it listed about 1,469 personnel in the British column, and on the back end it listed 976 out of that number killed or wounded, captured or missing. Very few were actually taken as prisoners. George Washington and several other key figures that will influence this period, they were there at Braddock's defeat. And it's a small wonder that Washington walked away from this battle unscathed. General Braddock himself was mortally wounded and dies a few days later. Every single one of General Braddock's staff officers were either killed outright or wounded, with the exception of George Washington, who had several bullet holes through his clothing, one through his hat, and he also had 2 horses shot from under him during the battle. Really an amazing thing that he survived unscathed. This battle, as I mentioned, it featured several figures who went on to have very influential careers in not just the French and Indian War, but also the American Revolution. And this is one theme that I would like you to think about today, is the importance of these military veterans who carry their experiences forward into future wars, like Dunmore's War, like the American Revolution itself. So let me give you a few examples here. Most famously, top left, George Washington. His whole military career is framed by the French and Indian War. That's where he learns to become a leader of men, a combat commander. To his on the top middle is Thomas Gage, who will go on to become the commander-in-chief of all British military forces in North America. In fact, Gage is the commander-in-chief while Dunmore's War is occurring, and Gage is monitoring this colonial conflict in Virginia, from his headquarters. Top right is Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan will emerge in this time period as a very formidable frontier fighter. He goes on to become a brigadier general in the Continental Army in the Revolution. And he wins, I'll go so far as to say he helps to win South Carolina's independence in the year 1781 at the Battle of Cowpens. In 1755, in Braddock's expedition, Morgan is just an unknown frontiersman. He's working as a wagon driver in Braddock's army. One of the Virginia provincial officers who is part of Braddock's expedition. He's not with the main army. He's detached here to the Augusta County area in 1755, but that's none other than Captain Andrew Lewis. Guess what? You're going to have a chance to meet Andrew Lewis today. And I'm personally really looking forward to that encounter. You know, Lewis is another case in point here of an officer who is just sharpened as a military officer through multiple wars and conflicts. And of course, Andrew Lewis is front and center in the whole story of Dunmore's War. On the bottom is Horatio Gates. He was a young captain at this point, but he will go on to become a major general in the Continental Army, and most famous for his victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, one of the decisive American victories of the war. Next to him is Charles Lee. No relation to the Virginia Lees. This was a British officer in Braddock's army, and for political reasons, he decides to side with the Americans as the American Revolution heats up. He also becomes a major general in the Continental Army. And interestingly, quick aside, Horatio Gates and Charles Lee both settle to the north of here. In fact, their houses are still standing. So I want you to think about this idea this weekend of how these the people that you're going to encounter in the story of Dunmore's War this weekend, how they're framed by their military experiences before 1774. Okay. Braddock's disaster has just a lot of terrible cascading consequences for the British. One of the worst things that happens is the French will capture all of General Braddock's artillery. They will in fact transport that artillery and use that against other British forts. Thank you very much for that gift that keeps on giving in the form of your artillery train. The French will also capture General Braddock's headquarters papers. And that's full of all sorts of incriminating evidence, right? So the French use that to really good kind of political and diplomatic effect. But one of the worst consequences for the British was the fact that the British Army, in essence, abandons the Maryland and Virginia frontiers. What's left of Braddock's regular army forces will actually, I do not exaggerate, go into winter quarters in Philadelphia in August. You heard that correctly. And the colonies here of Maryland and Virginia and soon Pennsylvania are basically left to their own devices. And what they have now is, as George Washington put it, Virginia was, quote, laid entirely open by the very avenue which had been prepared. What's he referring to there? Braddock's Road. So Braddock's Road now works as a highway in reverse, you see? And it allows the French and their native allies a highway straight to the heart of the Virginia frontier here. And so beginning soon after Braddock's defeat in 1755 and continuing really without interruption through 1758, there is just incessant French and Indian attacks and raids all along the extended frontier of Virginia. And George Washington, as the commander-in-chief of Virginia's military forces, he's left holding the bag here, trying to defend the colony, its people, its agricultural resources from destruction. And this is indeed a great challenge. I want to emphasize in my time remaining here that this ordeal on the Virginia frontier, where it's under incessant attack, that this is really a kind of crucible time period that helps to, even in the midst of defeat and disaster, it helps to meld Virginia's forces into a more effective military instrument. So I want you to see that there's a molding and shaping process that's going on even as the whole colony of Virginia is on the defensive. One of the ways that George Washington tried to remedy the situation was to create effective Virginia provincial troops. He has command not only of the Virginia militia, but a unit that on paper is roughly about 1,000 men called the Virginia Regiment. Has anybody ever heard of the Virginia Regiment that Washington commanded? Okay. This was kind of like his baby. And the Virginia Regiment is a unit that he is trying to build into kind of an exact model of a British regular army unit. Like he wants this Virginia Regiment to be completely up to snuff. And his hope, as you may know, is that the British might see this and say, wow, those Virginians are really impressive. And Washington's real hope is that the British would go so far as to say, you guys are so squared away and regular, we're actually going to take you on as a British Army regiment. Congratulations. You now have all royal commissions. And that was Washington's ambition, that he and his officers would therefore be elevated to full king's troops, essentially, with royal commissions. I think a lot of us know that. I got a lot of nodding heads there. I think you've heard that story before. What I think a lot of people miss is the degree to which Washington shaped this Virginia regiment into a force that was fully capable of fighting out here on the frontier and taking on the French and their native opponents on their terms and win. Let me give you a few examples here. Washington's Lieutenant Colonel, Adam Stephen, he's another guy, another one of these veterans. Stephen will go on to become a Continental Army general. In 1757, Stephen boasted that the Virginia regiment, here's the quote, knew the parade as well as the Prussians, and fighting in a close country as well as Tartars. Let me break that down for you. What he's saying is this Virginia regiment, they can parade and march around and drill just as well as the best infantry in Europe, the Prussian army. But he's saying that these Virginia regiment guys, they can fight in this frontier setting like the word he uses here is Tartars, and these are 18th century partisans back in Europe. Like he's basically saying they can fight like guerrillas, to use our term today. Washington also, in his correspondence and his records, makes very clear that he wanted these Virginians to be trained in how to fight in the woods. So he says things like this. He reports to Governor Dinwiddie that he had ordered his officers to train the men, quote, in the proper use of their arms and, listen to this, the Indian method of fighting. At one point in the war in 1758, Washington even proposes to equip the Virginia regiment in Indian-style clothing and garments. He proposes that very idea to senior British officers that he's reporting to at that time. As a quick aside, during this weekend, tomorrow, you're going to get to hear from a colleague named Neil Hurst, and he's going to talk to you about how the one article of a lot of these Virginia soldiers' clothing, the hunting shirt, it really becomes symbolic of how these Virginians are learning and kind of priding themselves on their ability to fight out in the woods. I should also add here, one of the most important, I think, moral victories that happened as a result of Braddock's defeat is that Virginians really took great pride after that battle that their forces actually fought with greater effectiveness, greater courage, if you will, than the British redcoats did. And during the Battle of Braddock's defeat, it's actually a force of American troops that forms the rear guard of the army and enables the British to basically get back across the river intact. And I want to mention this because things like that really become points of pride with these Virginia troops, whomever we're talking about, militia and Washington's Virginia regiment troops. They really pride themselves on those types of moments. Or how about this one? Over the course of this really grueling frontier war from 1755 to 58 on the Virginia frontier, the Virginians turned to several Indian nations for alliance. And some of those nations will, in fact, send warriors here to the Virginia frontier, to the valley, to help the Virginians defend themselves. So the Cherokees and the Catawbas from my neck of the woods down in South Carolina, the Tuscaroras from North Carolina, over the course of this conflict, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of native warriors that will come here to support their ally, Virginia. And guess what? A lot of those warriors will end up teaching, they will end up deploying with Virginia soldiers on things like reconnaissance missions, scouting missions, as they are trying to increasingly take the war back over the mountains to the doorsteps of the French and the Indians. I'll give you one famous example of this type of joint Virginia and Indian effort. In the year 1757, there's a small party of Virginia provincials and Cherokee warriors. They're led by a lieutenant named James Baker, and then one of the principal Cherokee war captains by the name of Swallow Warrior. And they actually are very close to the old battlefield of Braddock's defeat when this skirmish happens. And in this skirmish, the Cherokees and the Virginians, they actually spring an ambush on a French patrol. They end up killing, wounding, or capturing 3 French officers, one of whom gets hauled back to Virginia and ends up being imprisoned in Winchester for a short time. But do you see that the tide is turning here? And ultimately, at least in terms of the French and Indian War, the tide turned during Forbes's expedition in the year 1758. And it was in that year that the British will make another effort to accomplish what General Braddock had not been able to accomplish 3 years earlier: the capture of Fort Duquesne and the conquest of the Ohio Valley. Virginia troops are again part of this massive British expedition that numbers around 7,000 in total. And in this effort, British General John Forbes will march across the Appalachian Mountains, this time from within Pennsylvania. And he constructs a new military road across the mountains called Forbes Road. It will one day basically become the Lincoln Highway, U.S. Route 30. And so by 1758, the British, the Virginians have achieved their objective of projecting military force far into the interior of the continent and being able to sustain military forces and holding the Ohio Valley, having permanent garrisons there. And what I want you to see, let's start to draw a line here from 1758 to 1774. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, what we're going to see is, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania colonists using these very military roads to be able to access and to settle and trade in points west in the Ohio Valley. And that in turn creates a lot of tension with, again, the truest owners of the soil, the native peoples who live there. And so from the 1760s on, it's a slow boil. There are lots of tensions building between the British and the native peoples of the Ohio Valley. And those tensions, as we're going to see here this weekend, in a really powerful way, are going to erupt into what becomes Dunmore's War in 1774. Before I close, let me point out some other things that you're going to experience here this weekend. Some of the presenters and some of our living historians here are going to tell you stories about some of the different types of Virginia forces that are part of Dunmore's War. And you're going to learn in those conversations and talks about, again, how these forces became effective enough to bring the war right into Shawnee country in the lower Ohio Valley. You're also going to have a treat today. I've been personally looking forward to this for a long time. You're going to get to interact with, I'll say he's one of the nation's premier interpreters of Eastern Woodlands cultures, Talon Silverhorn. He's here, and he is a member of the Shawnee Nation, the Eastern Shawnee Nation. And so we're going to be able to look this weekend at Dunmore's War from all sorts of perspectives, and you are exactly in the right place here this weekend, and I hope that you truly enjoy it. At this time, let's stop, and I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks so much. Thank you.